upon a time when I was very young and first worked in pictures, I used to get awful worried about all the troubles. I wish all the bad things in the world could turn out to be just pretending. But this is happening. It's not a make-believe flood. And these people are really and truly getting hurt. And this is honest-to-goodness trouble.
Over the past 2 decades, we have come to see and almost expect these images of mass destruction on our television screens during the evening news hour. Our record of memories has been shaped by the images captured on film and television. We've come to expect and accept a regular parade of violence and destruction in the media. What we are about to see is a powerful record of the destructiveness of nature, as well as that of the human animal. Our story begins at the turn of the century, when theatergoers had the opportunity to witness, for the first time in recorded history, a true disaster, one that lives on in our memories to this very day. April 15, 1906, San Francisco was struck. An earthquake of enormous proportions rattled the elegant city, and the subsequent fire virtually destroyed the entire town. 7 years later, audiences saw a more graphic natural catastrophe. In Dayton, Ohio, floodwaters engulfed the entire town, destroying everything in its path. Millions of dollars in damage and a loss of 730 lives made this front-page news throughout the country. In this sad scene out of the past, we see the remnants of a story that today has been all but forgotten. By the early 30s, America was in the grip of the Great Depression, and scenes of nature's violence had a special effect on a population already reeling under the impact of severe economic distress. Moviegoers would go to the theaters 3 and 4 times a week, expecting to see newsreels that were often more exciting than the actual featured film.
The hurricane hunters. They track down incoming storms so that warnings may be issued in time. A pilot flies directly into the heart of the disturbance, carefully plotting the storm's direction and intensity from his pitching plane. He reports back his findings. 2 things are certain. A hurricane is heading this way, and as hurricanes go, this one is going to be a howling success. Who failed to heed the hurricane warnings, this is last call to head for the hills. The big blow sweeps inland, bringing some of the ocean with it. Cities usually safe from coastal storms get their taste of wind and wet. Soon not a living thing remains on the streets. This is the power and fury of weather gone wild. A hurricane at its height.
One of the most memorable newsreels of the day was taken of the Narrows Bridge outside Tacoma, Washington. The structure, which was one of the longest bridges of its day, would sadly have a very short history.
Most spectacular example of the wind's work was the mighty $6 million Tacoma Bridge, swaying in the gale as though its concrete and steel were made of rubber. A car has been abandoned, and a college professor can be seen out on the span making observations on the strange behavior of the third longest suspension bridge in the world. The professor flees for his life as Galloping Gertie's gyrations gain momentum. There she goes.
Scores of towns and fishing villages over a 200-mile area on Japan's northeast coast lie in ruins from the worst earthquake and fire to visit Nippon since the disaster of 1923. More than 2,500 natives are dead or missing, with thousands of houses wrecked and burned. Here at Kameshai, 1,000 dwellings fell. A tidal wave following the quake added to the list of victims. Only those who fled to the hills escaped. 1,500 vessels were swept ashore by the wall of water, and many in their crews drowned. Government aid is being rushed, but it will be a long time before this stricken region can be restored in the land of the rising sun.
Below is a sea of ice and a ship trapped as securely as a fly in a spider's web. When the ice buckles into massive chunks, it may swallow houses on the shore. Here's an ancient ice cutter that believes in try and try again. Ah, shucks, Captain, you better get a car. The real danger comes when the jam breaks and big cakes begin racing on the swollen river toward the cities downstream. Few things can withstand the crushing pressure of ton upon ton of ice. People stand on the bridges to watch the show, but they don't stay there long. Now the ice-choked river has new ammunition. Debris from the first bridge to help weaken the structure of the second and transform it into twisted wreckage. A car caught in the span goes hurtling down. A third bridge lies ahead, biggest and strongest of the lot. The load thrust against it grows heavier and heavier. Melting ice and snow and weeks of torrential rain bring the greatest hazard of all, flood. An avalanche of water thunders downward. Levees are blasted to change its course, but to no avail. Outlying farms, houses, and stores are first to be gobbled up. A riverside factory dependent upon water power gets enough water power to put it out of commission. More congested areas are reached, and soon whole blocks are doing a disappearing act into the mud and slime-filled waters. All of man's ingenuity cannot stop this now. The flood must run its course, leaving in its wake miles of ruin. For the disaster fighters, the job is saving lives. Victims of the deluge are picked up with surprising calm. Pets are also on the rescue list. And from their miniature Noah's Ark, they look mighty grateful. The current grows more and more ugly. This flood has become a raging killer capable of sweeping to doom any living thing in its path. For one youth, a tree trunk provides a precarious refuge. With a current too strong for boats, ropes are used. Along one rope, a survivor is carried to safety. Out in those dark and swirling waters, so near and yet so far from rescue, a man and a woman are trapped on top of a car. Disaster fighters work desperately to reach them in these on-the-spot films, among the most dramatic ever photographed. But in this life-or-death battle, death wins. The car and its human burden are swept away to destruction.
Here's an airplane view of the Ohio River flood as it pours through outlying sections of Cincinnati and neighboring cities in Kentucky. More than 20 towns have been inundated, and many thousands have been forced to abandon their homes for higher ground along more than half of the river's 1,200-mile course. From the sky, the area about Dayton and Covington presents a regular Venetian panorama. The second flood crest within a week invaded the wholesale business district of Cincinnati, doing enormous damage and bringing traffic to a standstill, except for rowboats. Bridges were imperiled as the Ohio rose 12 feet above flood level. Smaller structures were swept away, including the garage you see being taken for a ride. But at last reports, it was hoped the worst was over.
The audience's fascination with disaster did have positive effects. Many of the scenes of the flooded Mississippi so moved us that millions of Americans demanded that something be done about the flooding. In time, much of this kind of damage was controlled through technological ingenuity. However, man's efforts to shelter ourselves from the forces of nature have not been without its costs. Indeed, when we took on great challenges, some have paid with tragic setbacks. When the Wright brothers flew their powered craft on December 17, 1903, few people would believe that airplanes would become a practical way to travel. And from these early attempts, you can see why.
Poised precariously on a Connecticut bridge, this inventor might become an eagle, but he has a better chance of becoming an angel. His bat wing special.
Now, an awesome moment as the first rocket plane is fueled for a precedent-shattering flight. An asbestos-clad scientist lights the fuse, then runs for cover. There's no telling how far this revolutionary rocket ship may travel. Perhaps into outer space, perhaps to the very moon. With the first rocket mail, years later, science marches on. Vast improvements have been made on the early primitive rocket. And now,
that's what happened to the letter you've been expecting. In Toledo, an inventive genius gets all juiced up to prove the hard way that every man can be his own rocket ship. And away we go. Rocket schmocket. Sam, you made the pants too hot. Pile for the wood. She's running wild. A pilot could easily lose his head if he ran in the wrong direction. Early helicopters were dangerous. Careful, men. Watch out for tricks. In Detroit, the first umbrella helicopter makes its bow. As light as lead and cast iron could make her, this undergrown carousel was supposed to jump into the air. Try this on your next hangover. Back in France, there appeared a new kind of copter driven by a pair of oversized pinwheels. This aerial bucking bronco had the stability of an intoxicated chorus girl and required a ground crew skilled in the 100-yard dash. gas bag, and a pilot were added for control. Some control. Just let her loose, and where she goes, nobody knows. They called her the Flying Sausage, but to that perspiring ground crew, she was just a lot of baloney. This is how they got airsick back in 1921. Featuring the upsweep wing, this sturdy plane was designed for intercontinental flight. With luck, it might get across the street.
Here is the short story of the Seagull plane, which in the realm of flight was just successful enough to be a crashing failure.
In Germany, Otto Lilienthal bets on a sure thing by imitating the flight of birds, even the flapping wings and feathers. But when the swallows come back to Capistrano, Otto won't be along. Up in Maine, the wooden eagle is unveiled to a waiting world. Those who came to ridicule remain to watch in amazement as it flies to pieces.
These were but minor setbacks in our attempt to conquer the sky. With plane travel becoming increasingly popular, far greater tragedies were about to occur. One of the most famous of these events happened at the Empire State Building on July 28, 1948, at 9:45 in the morning. A B-25 bomber flying a routine mission in dense fog hit the then tallest structure in the world. It struck between the 78th and 79th floors, killing all 3 airmen on board and several people inside the building. The tragedy could have been much worse if it weren't for the fact that the plane hit on a Saturday with 90% of the tenants away from their offices. Airplanes weren't the only area of aviation that encountered serious problems. Crafts lighter than the air, dirigibles, were soon featured in the news in a far from favorable light.
By the mid-30s, the blimp was capable of some astonishing tricks of its own. Hovering directly over the world's tallest building, this airship picks up the afternoon mail. Leaving the Empire State behind, it's a trip out to sea for a special delivery to an ocean liner. Careful, mailman, that smokestack's not a mail slot. Now let's turn from the blimp to the biggest of lighter-than-air craft, the rigid airship, or Zeppelin. Used by Germany in World War I, some were shot down, but others got through to rain bombs on London. At war's end, France acquired the German-built Dixmude. Its complete disappearance with all hands remains a great unsolved mystery. In 1919, Britain, busily engaged on an extensive dirigible production program, unveiled her R-29. Nothing has ever approached the streamlined skinniness of this snake of the skies. The British R-33 suffered a broken nose in a runaway flight over the North Sea, but was brought home safely. The R-38, built by England for America, broke in half on a test flight, plunging into the River Humber and killing 45 of her crew. From Italy, the U.S. Navy purchased the Roma, a semi-rigid airship with a collapsible gas bag, but a solid keel attached beneath. In 1922, the Roma took off on a flight that was to be her last. Moments later, after plummeting to the earth and exploding, she lies below a smoking ruin. First American-built Zeppelin was the Shenandoah, daughter of the stars. The wreckage of this $2 million ship dots the Ohio countryside after a sudden squall tore her apart in midair. 14 were killed, 27 miraculously escaped. In this glistening airship, man's fondest dreams of lighter-than-air travel seem to have come true. She could be used as an aircraft carrier, with planes like tiny gnats hooking on and dropping from trapeze arrangements attached to her great underbelly. But the Akron seemed marked for disaster from the beginning. In 1932, while she was attempting to moor, a gust of wind swept her skyward so suddenly that 3 men of her ground crew were pulled high into the air. The grip of one man loosened, and he fell to his death. The second man followed him to destruction. But the third crewman hung on and was saved. Shortly afterward, the Akron passed above New York City, seeming to glide over the tops of the buildings below. She was only 17 months old when, with a crew of 76 aboard, she moved out to sea to her doom in a storm. Bits of wreckage marked her resting place. Her sister ship, the Macon, already under construction when the Akron was lost, followed her into service. Mooring an airship as big as a skyscraper tipped on its side was a ticklish job. The Macon hadn't yet reached her second birthday when she journeyed out to Point Sur, California, to maneuver with the fleet in the Pacific. Here she settled into the sea, and of the proud Macon, soon only an oil slick remained. In 1937, the Hindenburg, a flying luxury liner with observation decks and lounge rooms for her passengers, began her second year of regular transatlantic service. Because of Germany's lack of helium, the Hindenburg was filled with explosive hydrogen. Coming in for a landing at Lakehurst, New Jersey with 97 aboard, the Hindenburg dropped her lines. Everything seemed in perfect order, when suddenly... death of the Hindenburg, the majestic queens of the sky were seen no more, floating in beauty above the earth. And so it ended, the fabulous era of lighter than air.
Air travel hasn't been the only frontier man has attempted to conquer. From the beginning of time, the sea has challenged us to pit our ingenuity against it. On April 9, 1912, the Titanic left on its maiden voyage. It was called the fastest ship, the most luxurious liner on the sea, and touted as unsinkable. It would become one of the greatest man-made disasters of this century. 1,502 people lost their lives on the night of April 14, 1912, in this region of glaciers. It was visited by a newsreel crew in later years.
No greater menace to shipping exists than these frozen mountains, which only show 1/3 of their bulk above the surface. They are responsible for a long list of disasters, including the sinking of the Titanic 21 years ago.
A few years after the Titanic went down, the luxury liner Lusitania left port in New York for England. This time, it was a German torpedo that sank the ship with over 1,500 people going down. The impact of a boat the size of a skyscraper sinking can best be seen in these newsreel shots of the flying Enterprise. When the ship began taking on water, the captain, Kurt Carlson, ordered his crew to abandon ship. For 13 days, he kept the ship afloat, trying to get it towed into port. The sea would win the battle, with waves finally sinking the ship, forcing the captain and his remaining assistant to jump overboard. Since time immemorial, man's struggle to understand and conquer the forces of nature has been a continuing series of trials and errors. But the greatest challenge to his problem-solving capacity is himself. Whenever a new invention was created, it immediately became an instrument of war. Man has been fascinated by our constant waging of battles, and it is no coincidence that as soon as the motion pictures were invented, its cameramen went right to the scene of the conflict. These shots of our boys being killed helped rally public support for our nation's participation in the Spanish-American War. Theatergoers acquired an unprecedented awareness of the intensity of war.
This is confidential. So I'm staking this past the censor.
By the Second World War, Hollywood had fully become part of the war effort, with Bob Hope, Betty Grable, Harpo Marx, Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, and Ronald Reagan, teaching us the lessons of war at first hand.
What a mistake that baby made. Suddenly it was right in my sight.
By the end of the war, our technology had gone so far in creating disaster makers that motion pictures had a hard time explaining them away, even to our own fighting men. Soldiers saw the following film soon after the test of the Defense Department's most powerful new weapon.
There were Genghis Khan's mounted hordes, then gunpowder, the machine gun, tank, the airplane. Is this the end of the rifleman? The damage to military equipment, like trucks, weapons, comes mostly from being dragged or rolled over the ground. Armored vehicles, because of their greater weight, are more resistant to the shock waves. Human beings also are very resistant to direct effects of the blast. It takes a far greater shock to injure you than to knock down these buildings. Most casualties from the blast are caused by its indirect effects. Men get hurt by flying bricks, glass, limbs of trees, rocks, or by buildings falling in on them. Of course, if you are standing in the open, you can be up and hurled through the air until you come to a sudden casualty-producing stop.
When the bomb was finally used, it changed our world unlike any weapon ever had. What we created made any of the disasters we've seen pale in comparison. Man tried to use nature, and nature gave us back more than we had bargained for. These are images that will never leave our memories.
From the instant of that first blast until Hiroshima vanished from the list of living cities, closely guarded plants in New Mexico, Tennessee, and the state of Washington continued their work to shorten the war. Hiroshima, one of Japan's arsenal cities, was selected as the first to feel the weight of atomic power. 21 days after the New Mexico dress rehearsal, a lone B-29 was over Hiroshima carrying an atomic bomb. At 8:15 in the morning of August 6, Japanese time, the first atomic bomb hit an enemy target. The bomb was aimed to explode above 0 point, a spot in the city at the junction of the Motoyisu and Ota rivers. The bomb was intentionally set to explode well above the 0 point to dissipate its radioactivity. Here is the pictorial record of the result. At 0 point, directly beneath the explosion, the soldier in the scene is pointing at the spot from which all damage to the surrounding area was measured in terms of distance from the center of the blast. Within a mile of 0 point, the devastation speaks for itself. But in these very ruins, Army cameramen have found and filmed pictorial evidence that tells in twisted steel and stone the effect of death-dealing atomic power. For example, this was the site of the main Japanese military headquarters. There were approximately 20,000 Japanese military personnel stationed here. They are among the missing. A lone concrete smokestack indicates where a bustling factory once stood. Reinforced concrete buildings seem to have withstood the explosion fairly well, the damage varying with their distance from 0 point. Within an area of a mile to a mile and a half, this type of building was the only type to withstand complete demolition and destruction. Here's a building that was knocked sidewise, giving you an idea of the force of the blast. The direction of the blast is graphically told by the slant of this parapet, a concrete wall. Etched in the stone base of what was the Russo-Japanese War Memorial are telltale lines, atomic handwriting for all to read. Another signpost of the direction and force of the explosion is blasted in the polished granite base of this statue. The light surface indicates the angle of the blast, 2/10 of a mile from 0 point. Many of the shattered windows pointed like skeleton fingers the direction of the atomic wind of death. On one side, blown in. On the other, blown out, with atomic tornado force. Inside, the flash burns on the chairs give eloquent testimony on the heat of the blast a mile from 0 point, which singed the mohair upholstery like a blowtorch. Hiroshima City Hall, which stood at an angle of 45 degrees to the direction of the explosion, had its doors and windows blown in, but suffered much less damage than buildings squarely in the path of the blast. The windows and doors offer mute evidence of the way the blast swept into the structures. The destructive circle within a mile from 0 point had a few notable exceptions, mainly reinforced concrete. On the edge of the area of greatest damage was a landmark, the Red Cross Hospital, which never ceased functioning, although it sustained damage. Today, it dominates the desert of a debris that was Hiroshima. Another notable exception to the general demolition was the Higaski Railroad Station in East Hiroshima, a mile and a half from the center of the blast. This building, however, suffered extensive damage. The twisted steel beams and concrete wall show the effects of the tremendous concussion. What's left of the Commercial Museum, within 2/10 of a mile of 0 point, also gives indication of the tremendous push of the explosion. The downward force of the blast turned the roof of the Commercial Museum into a reservoir. Amazingly enough, bridges did not suffer too badly at Hiroshima. This steel rail bridge, 1 mile from 0 point, had the side toward the explosion virtually blasted by flying particles, which removed almost all the paint. But the side away from the explosion did not need a new paint job. Roads in the area fared better than buildings or bridges. Shortly after the fires died down, traffic was resumed. Today, these highways through the ruins are again in use. Beside our military traffic trudge the survivors of vanished Hiroshima, the first city in history to be atom bombed into oblivion. Even 4 miles away, the effects of the atomic blast were felt. Although a hill between the novitiate of the Jesuits and 0 Point lessened the intensity, windows of the main building were shattered. A group of priests witnessed and survived the Hiroshima blast. One of them, Father John Zymus, tells what he actually saw. An eyewitness account.
I was in my room, which faces the valley, and suddenly I saw a light, like magnesium light, flashlight, which filled the whole valley. And looking out of my window to find out the reason for this peculiar phenomena, I saw nothing besides this light. And turning from the window to the door of my room, I heard a crash. It may have been 10 seconds after seeing the light, the flashlight. And immediately I was covered with splinters of the window frames and glass sticking into the walls and actually in my flesh itself. After a while, we saw a procession of people coming from the outskirts of the city up the valley. Many of them, most of them, were wounded, especially the parts of the body which were not covered by clothes, like hands, feet, back. All of us who lived through this experience at the spot estimate the numbers of deaths at least as 100,000.
The United States demanded an unconditional surrender after Hiroshima. When 3 days passed without an answer to the ultimatum, a second target was selected.
Exactly 3 days after Hiroshima, a B-29 set out for Nagasaki. Instructions were precise. To the north, Japan's greatest torpedo plant. To the south, steel and arms works were located in the heart of the city. The bomb was aimed midway between the two plants to cause greatest possible damage. Because the plants were located in a valley, surrounding hills shielded most residential areas and concentrated the damage on the industrial section. At 10:58 the morning of August 9th, the bomb was exploded above the city, and in the towering mushroom, Japan could read its doom. This was more than a routine bombing. It was the funeral pyre of an aggressor nation. The bomb had been purposely exploded high, so that the greatest part of its radioactive material was dissipated in the stratosphere. From the air, the skeletons of the Mitsubishi plants made evident that Nagasaki's war-making power was totally destroyed. For the valley area of little more than 3 square miles, blast and fire reduced the industrial plants and surrounding buildings to blackened rubble. The Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works extended almost a mile in length. Before the blast, these were modern buildings constructed like our own American factories. Closer examination of the ruins shows the same complete destruction that characterized the ruins of Hiroshima. Damage to equipment and machinery used in the manufacture of naval rifles, AA guns, and heavy artillery was such that even if Japan had determined to commit suicide by continuing resistance, she could not have salvaged much from the ruins. Smokestacks bent but did not break before the blast. And roads were unaffected, people using them without ill effect shortly after the explosion. The ruins revealed beyond doubt the existence of the shadow factories the Japanese had set up in the nearby residential areas of the industrial valley. You have seen the swath of destruction created by atomic power in this tale of two cities. The world's greatest minds in science, statecraft, and military matters are wrestling with the problems created by the atom. On this spot, outlined in stone, is a figure representing the average man, regardless of his race or creed. These atomic footprints on the sands of time can never be erased. They point a path which leads to unparalleled progress or unparalleled destruction. Just as in the darkness of the desert morning, when the atomic age was born, Atomic power puts the question squarely to mankind.
As difficult as these films may be to watch, they give us something no one in past history could see. A searing reminder of what happened, of the terrible power of nature, and of man's capacity to surpass her. Our greatest threat is ourselves. Our greatest challenge is to understand this human animal. I'm George Takei.